The Brisbane River has a long history of flooding. The Turrbal and Yagara people talk about floods long before the British settlers even arrived. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook. I'm an historian and I'm a researcher at the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. I wrote the book A River with a City Problem, which looked at the history of Brisbane River flooding. The British have often settled on rivers and they look very appealing when it's not flooding. It's a lovely, beautiful setting, isn't it, for a city? So you build on a river and you think, what could possibly go wrong? Brisbane's biggest recorded flood was in 1841 when there weren't very many people here at all, and it didn't really have an impact. In fact, it didn't even make it to the newspapers particularly. The flood that we really talk about is the 1893 floods, and there were two huge floods in a fortnight, and they're the second biggest floods and third biggest floods on record. They absolutely destroyed this part of Australia. So Brisbane was flattened by floods. The bridge that connected the north side with the south side, the Victoria Bridge, was swept away, and the two sides of the city were isolated from each other for 3 years. The other significant flood that people talk about is the 1974 flood. That was 5 metres, and that was after Somerset Dam was built. So it was reduced by about 1 metre, but it still caused devastating damage, and in fact more damage than 1893 because of the number of people that had moved to the city. The myth about Wivenhoe Dam is that it was built in response to the 1974 floods, but that's actually not true. It was already planned from the 1960s, and the reason Wivenhoe Dam was built, its primary reason, was that Brisbane wouldn't have enough water supply by 1981, and they decided that while they were building a dam for water supply, you'd deal with our other problem, which is flood mitigation. So from the 1960s, they started resuming land, and then after the 1974 flood, they did speed it up, and so they largely built the dam by 1984. It was opened in 1985. Then we're looking at the 2011 flood, which was about a 4 metre flood, but it was a different flood because it was mainly a river flood, so the creeks didn't play as big a part. So the flooding that happened was more upstream and more related to the river. And then sadly we had a flood in 2022, and that was actually more like the 1974 flood because it was a river flood, but more importantly, the creeks really flooded. And so lots of parts of Brisbane in particular got flooded that hadn't been flooded since 1974 because of those creeks. So every flood is different, and it makes it really hard to predict where that water's going to go. So we need to actually have an understanding of our flood history to really appreciate how complex and complicated all of this actually is. Floods will come again. We live in a subtropical climate and we've built on a subtropical river that's prone to flooding. So what we need to think about is how we're going to live with these floods. What are we going to do as humans that change our behaviour to be able to live in harmony with a flood-prone river?